Hello, welcome to the Talent Parent Nutrition presentation. Hopefully you'll be able to hear myself, and as we progress through this webinar, you should be able to see the presentation as well. For those of you that have not accessed the webinar before, during the webinar, please can you ensure that you have yourself muted and that your camera is turned off during the presentation. So there should be a red mic button at the top of your screen to enable yourself to be muted there. For those people that are listening through a phone, please ensure that you have yourself muted as well. So before we start, I'd just like to introduce myself. My name's Daniel Thompson. I'm the Talent Programme Administration Officer for British Canoeing. So my primary role is managing the day-to-day administration and operational delivery of the England Talent Programme. So in the room with myself today is Matthew Thompson. Matt works for the English Institute of Sport and is the strength and conditioning coach for British Canoeing. So I just want to start by thanking you all for accessing this webinar today. So this is the third webinar as part of the Talent Parent Programme. I hope that you've been able to access the previous two, being a parent or carer in elite sport and planning for sport webinar. If you haven't had the chance to watch these yet, then these have been uploaded onto the Talent Parent webpage on the Webinars and Video Resources tab. So this programme will better engage, support parents in the sometimes difficult and often underappreciated role that they play in the development of our talent athletes. So this webinar, along with additional resources, will get uploaded onto the Talent Parent webpage sometime next week. So without further ado, I'll pass you over to Matt.
Evening all, thanks for listening in. In this webinar, I guess we'll cover a couple of topics. I guess just to open us up, I guess what it isn't is the be-all and end-all of nutrition or sport nutrition. But what it should give you is some reasonably good idea of fueling performance and the underpinners of good fueling for performance. We'll look at a couple of different topics this evening, mainly macronutrients, their function and examples, the three key macronutrients, where do we get them from, how much, when, and in which context. We'll then look at making good choices and nutritionist behavior, what this means on a daily basis, around packed lunches, school lunches, and then cover a little bit about travel, particularly traveling abroad, and ensuring good nutrition in environments that maybe aren't as or simply aren't the same as home. And finally, we'll have a look at hydration, why it's important for performance. Again, how much do we need, and what are the potential negative effects? So if we start with the most important macronutrient then, carbohydrate. In simple terms, carbohydrate is the major fuel or energy provider to everyday and sporting life. It's the major fuel that allows the muscle, not only the muscle, but also the brain to function. So what do we know about carbohydrate then? Well, we effectively know that stores in the muscles and liver are limited, and therefore ensuring muscle glycogen is topped up is vital. Because the body has a limited amount of space or storage for glycogen, it can be used up reasonably quickly. And therefore, there are two types of carbohydrates. When we talk about carbohydrate, we talk about them in simple or complex terms. The simple carbohydrates are those sugary, starchy carbohydrates, mostly found in sugary cereals, white bread, flapjack, bagels, jams, that type of food, versus the more complex carbohydrate, those that are found in rice, potatoes, pulses, vegetables. The simple carbohydrates are those that will give you a really quick energy boost, those that will deliver glucose to the blood system really quickly, versus the complex ones that take a little bit longer to to break down and therefore provide a little bit more sustainable energy. And the thing to think about here is, what are we fueling for? Is it pre or post session? Might we have a session subsequent to the session that we're doing now? And therefore, which one might be appropriate when? So I think if you're looking for a quick fix or a quick spike, then the simple carbohydrates are good and are really important. But for sustainable energy, we need the more complex carbohydrate. The main meals of the day should definitely be made up of the more complex carbohydrate. If we're looking at amounts of carbohydrate, and where should these fit within the day? Well, around a half or a third of the plate of food should definitely come from carbohydrate. Remembering though that vegetables provide some of that content, or around 0.5 to 6 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. So for a 50 kilo individual, that's 300 or 400 grams of carbohydrate a day. And when we look at it as to what does that look like, well, 40 grams of oats or 2 Weetabix in the morning will give you around 25 or 30 grams of carbohydrate. A bread roll, or an average size of a bread roll, is about 25 grams of carbohydrate. Dried pasta, around the same, or a medium jacket potato will give you about 40 grams of carbohydrate. So the second one then, the second macronutrient is protein. Protein plays an important role in growth and repair of the muscle, with around 50% of the body weight coming from protein, mostly found in the skeletal system. Hence why it's really important in canoeing. What we know about canoe is that it's a strength and power sport, and a key determinant of performance is strength and power. Therefore, maximizing muscle mass or lean tissue is really important. We find these foods mainly in animal and plant-based products. Your fish, your chicken, meat, but also the dairy-based products, cheese, milk. The recommendation here is 20 grams of protein per meal or per serving, which will give you around 1 to 1.5 grams per kilogram body weight per day. Again, that's about 75 grams of protein for a 50 kilo individual. A couple of things to talk about here is that 20 grams per serving will give you sufficient protein in your diet to support muscle growth or the building blocks of growth and repair, which then effectively means that is supplementation appropriate? The advice, and our advice in the pathway, is absolutely not. Particularly at this age, we absolutely feel that we can get enough protein or carbohydrate for that matter from a really good balanced diet. The thing to think about with supplements as well is the risk and the dangers of contamination. No supplement can be 100% safe, and therefore is taken at the athlete's own risk. When it comes to some of the protein supplements, obviously the Informed Sport website should always be checked to make sure they've been batch tested. But again, you can't guarantee they're 100% safe and what factory they've came out of. But through a balanced diet, we can absolutely get the recommended amount. So if we're looking at 20 grams of protein per serving, then what does that look like, or what does 20 grams look like? Well, a pint of milk, a tin of tuna, or a tin of beans will give you 20 grams of protein. There are plenty of products out there on the supermarket shelves now that have got 20 grams of protein in. The yogurts, for example, the Arla yogurts now, Skyr yogurt provides 20 grams of protein in their tubs. So absolutely we can get it from our diet. And the third macronutrient is fats. Good fats provide the essential nutrients the body potentially can't produce itself. But what we do know is that fats are essential for day-to-day function. The omega-3s and the omega-6 are the essential fats that come out of nuts, oils, olive oils, avocados, oily fish, mackerel, those types of foods. And the recommendation here is around between 10 and 20% of a plate should look like a fat. Particularly in the development child or the development athlete, I wouldn't limit the amount of fats or good fats that are put into the system. When you talk about fats, we obviously talk about saturated and non-saturated fats. Saturated fats are the ones to be aware of, obviously. They're the ones that have been linked to diabetes, heart disease, high cholesterol. And I guess as well, most of us are well aware, they're mostly found in those processed foods, biscuits, crisps, burgers, donuts, those types of foods. But again, don't limit saturated fats in the developing child or the developmental athlete. And fats should absolutely play a part in our diet. So with these three things in mind then, putting these together on a plate, what does that look like? And the government put out some really good guidelines around a perfect plate. So the caveat to this is that I guess there is never a perfect plate. There is never one combination of all of the nutrients that are important. So, for example, I guess if we're doing some endurance training, the carbohydrate may need to increase from that half or that third to a little bit more. But remember, this can come from veg and snacking too. So the main meal might well look the same, but throughout the day we've snacked on more carbohydrate. But the guidelines here are around 30% of the plate should look like carbohydrate to provide enough energy or sustainable energy. 20% should look like protein, 10 or 20% from oils and dairy, and 20% from vegetables. The other thing to think about here, and there's two other things to think about here, particularly in the developmental ages, is calcium. Don't limit dairy product, or try not to limit dairy products. And the other one, particularly in the female athlete, is iron. And having iron within the diet. Remember, iron comes from the green leafy vegetables like broccoli. So they're two things to think about as well when we're putting this plate together. The other thing, remembering fruit and veg. Remember the vitamins and minerals that come from fruit and veg, but also the antioxidants that are in some of the berries, cherries, tart cherries have got a number of antioxidants, blueberries, that can help with recovery and repair post good training session. So on a practical basis, what does this look like? And our message is always food first in every sense. Always look to get a real good balance of our fats, carbohydrates, and proteins. And a good way of doing this is obviously Tupperware. The question I think we've got to ask here, and these are examples of lunches, potential lunches. Is a packed lunch more beneficial than school lunch or college lunch or wherever we're eating out? because I guess it's easy to find carbohydrates. It's really easy to find carbs. But remember that a palmful of protein is also important. And then is there enough fruit and veg? Is there enough essential vitamins and minerals within the meal that is potentially what we're eating out? So I guess a couple of examples of this is chicken wrap with vegetables, a bit of dip in hummus on the side, and a snack pot of fruit and yogurt would provide a sufficient lunchtime meal to fuel not only the day but also potentially, and this is something else to think about, is are we going to training post school, college, work, whatever it might be. And when we're thinking about are we going to training post school or whatever it is what are we doing between the car? What are we doing in the car or on route to the course? And what does our pre-session fuel look like? Remember, the pre-session fuel should give us sufficient energy to fuel the whole session. So it has to potentially come from some of them complex carbohydrates, but we might well need a little spike in energy, a little something from some simple carbohydrates, maybe a banana or some dried fruit. But is there some porridge there, some pasta or some bircher muesli, for example, that will give us a little bit more sustainable energy? But then post-session, and remember when we're talking about post-session, this is immediately post-session, with the thought of we're going home to eat a proper meal. That post-session will supply us with sufficient energy or carbohydrates to replenish what we've lost in the session, but also that 20 grams of protein for growth and repair. The thing we didn't mention before was the magic window around protein. There was a couple of years ago, there was some literature kicked around to suggest this magic 20 minutes post-session in which protein synthesis was enhanced. Yes, we would advocate trying to get it in as quickly as possible, but as long as the protein intake has been matched over the subsequent 24 hours, we should be fine. But getting that balance right and making sure that we do get our 70 or 80 grams of protein in throughout the day is the most important thing. So don't think you've got to smash it in straight away, but think about what have we had in our meal at lunchtime or at breakfast as well. The other thing to think about here is what are we fueling for? Is it a water session or is it a gym session? Remember, the water session is potentially a little more energetic, cost us a little bit more energy, and therefore we might have to just up our carbohydrate intake, versus the gym session that potentially is a little less metabolic, but a little bit more muscle damaging, and therefore protein is therefore then important. But just having a bit of a think of what we do in pre and post session. So our top tips here, and a bit of a recap and a couple of top tips, is one, to always create a shopping list. Remember, it's never a good idea to go shopping hungry. And don't expect Tesco to give you inspiration for food or for dinner. It never works, it never happens. But planning a shopping list, what are we doing Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday? Have I got school and then training on Monday, and therefore I need a snack after school? I might need a bigger lunch on a Tuesday because I've got a double session day, therefore I have to plan what I'm eating at lunchtime and what I'm having post-session. But remember, this is also this links to the second top tip, is around meal prep and batch cooking. A big lasagna or a big bolognese or a big chili or whatever it might be will also not save you time, but also potentially some cost. Going to the shop, and I know myself, going to the shop every night to find dinner, it's quite expensive. But being prepared, because if you've only got half an hour between getting somewhere and then getting to training or getting from training to somewhere else, batch cooking and just having something in the freezer you can just take out really quickly and eat in a Tupperware saves us both time and potentially some cash. And the third thing is kit bag essentials. Is there something in our kit bags that we can just go to? It might be that we forgot dinner that day, or that we just need a quick pick-me-up before the session or post the session. So if we've got a cereal bar in there that can potentially stay there for a while, some nuts, a bag of nuts or a banana or just something, a yogurt, it might be that there's something in there that we can just get a hold of really quickly. Which also again then brings us on to not just kit bag essentials, but travel. What we know about travel is that, again, carbohydrates are usually easy to come by. And therefore, some form of portable protein option is something that we might have to think about packing. Tin of tuna, a bag of beef jerky. Might be something that we can just stick in our bags. I know that we've advocated taking things like Uncle Ben's rice that you can put in the microwave, something that is familiar. And I think that's the other thing as well, is that what we're eating pre-race, potentially out in Bratz or Germany or wherever it is that we have a race plan and a race profile, and we want to try and stick to things that are familiar. So a bag of Uncle Ben's rice, there's a lot of really good stuff out there at the minute around, and there's a picture there about the Uncle Ben's creator, John West Creations, or a noodle pot that we can just pour water into. They provide us with sufficient nutrients to serve the session that we're about to fuel for sure. Other things that might include porridge pots or cereal bars, little bags of couscous. And I will put on the website, I'll put some ideas, some kit bag ideas, so that we can have a bit of a look at that if that would help us. The thing to think about with all of this is that when we're fueling, it's about energy in and energy out. If we're training hard and physical activity is high, we potentially have to put a little bit more in. If we're training a little less, you might well not need the amount of carbohydrate that you had in on a heavy training day. And I guess a really simple and easy way to monitor it is just body mass or body weight. Look for signs of weight loss, which is effectively a sign of insufficient energy. Or on the flip side to that, fat gain, which is potentially an energy surplus or an incorrect balance of macros. But what we do know and what we absolutely advocate is that we're fueling the adolescent child or the development athlete is fueling hunger. If they're hungry, allow them to eat. Don't limit energy availability. Make sure there's plenty of carbohydrate and plenty of protein in their systems. So lastly then, we'll talk about hydration. Well, what do we know about water in the system? Well, we know that 60% of body weight is made up of water. It keeps our kidneys, respiratory system, and cardiovascular system working. It also provides an efficient and effective cooling system to maintain body temperature. What we know is that when we exercise, it creates heat. The heat increases blood flow, which increases sweat to regulate temperature, and therefore this sweat or liquid needs replacing. Interestingly, the most important thing here is that a 2% decrement in hydration, some of you might have heard this, can lead to as much as a 15% decrease in strength and power. Remember, we're a strength and power sport. And some of the other side effects are fatigue, reduction in strength, heat stress, reduced concentration or skill and accuracy, and are potentially all just inadequate or intake of liquid. The thing to think about here is that if you're thirsty, you've gone too far. So sipping little and often is important. Other things to consider, and particularly if you're talking about travel, is that if there is additional heat there is potentially additional sweating. So that 2 to 3 litres a day that is the average recommended guidance might well just need to be adjusted a little bit more, a little bit less. But sipping regularly and ensure that we're not thirsty is really important. Something else we get asked a lot around hydration is sports drinks. The thing to think about with sports drinks and consider with sports drinks is they contain a lot of carbohydrates. And our question is always, is the amount of carbohydrate necessary, or do you need to replenish that amount of carbohydrate if your session isn't very long? Or if we've already had a snack before our session and we're about to refuel post-session? I guess the normal training sessions that are ran in the sport are not extreme by any sense. They're not in extreme conditions, or they're not in extreme prolonged periods of time, and therefore do we need the carbohydrate? Caveat to that is yes, absolutely. If you need a bit of a boost within the session and you just need some quick sugar, so you need some simple carbohydrates to up-regulate blood sugar, yes, then they could be super useful. But again, I think if you've got a bottle of water at your session, and you've got a bottle of water and I might have some fruit juice in it, there'll be sufficient there to fuel the session that we're about to have. And it's a really simple way to measure hydration. It's just simply through the urine. It's through a urine test, or looking at the color of our pee. What it should look like is pale or straw-like in color, and should be plentiful. If it's dark and concentrated and there isn't very much of it, it's a potential sign of dehydration or severe dehydration. And again, if that's the type of color that we've got, then sipping little and often on water is the guideline. So as a quick recap before we answer some questions, eating a balanced diet of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins is recommended during or throughout the pathway. Half to a third of the plate should look like carbohydrates. 20 grams of protein in each meal or each serving, which accumulates to about 1.1 to 1.5 grams per kilogram body mass. And never limit fats. Around 10 to 20% of the plate should look like good fats, oils, nuts, avocado, that type of good fats. And always remember, nutrition is reasonably simple around matching energy intake to energy output. I guess it is hard, potentially hard in this group setting, to really dig deep into some individual stuff around matching energy demand. And it will definitely depend on physical activity, what they're doing at school. But I guess always eat to hunger and follow the general guidelines is the advice. Eat regularly, and potentially measure some, not body comp, but some weight, just as a balance of energy intake. Remember, nutrition is a behavior, and making good choices consistently is important. So whether that's when we're out for a meal, whether that's at school or at college, or we're eating dinner, it's packed lunches. And again, on an evening, what does our plate look like? Are we eating a rainbow? Is sufficient protein in the system or on the plate? And always stay hydrated, sipping little and often. Hopefully that was useful, and there were some little things in there to pick out and to take home. We have a couple of questions that were already sent in, and we've got a lot of questions, which is really good. And I'm completely aware that I potentially haven't answered some of them. I'll answer a couple of them now. What I will do with the rest of the questions, however, is I will I will write the answer to the questions, or I'll answer them tonight or tomorrow, and I'll get them sent out. I'll also ask our nutritionists. There was a number of questions on vegetarians and vegetarian diets, and how do we potentially increase some of the protein, and how do we make sure we're getting an energy balance with vegetarian in a vegetarian diet. I will make sure there is a fact sheet or a one-pager on this stuff, because it's clearly super important, and there's a lot of people asking the same question. So I'll get a one-pager out to you, get it on the Talent site. Hopefully that'll answer your questions. But by all means, if there is anything else that we haven't answered, please send them to either me or Daniel, and I will answer them. There's a couple of questions on the sidebar that I will also answer tonight and tomorrow. But there's a couple now that I will answer.
Yeah, so thank you there, Matt. So as Matt mentioned, now is an opportunity to, if you've got any specific questions that you want to ask, if you want to drop that into the chat feature, and within the next sort of 5 to 10 minutes, Matt will do his best to answer as many as we can do. So whilst we wait for anybody to ask any questions, there was a couple of that did come through before the in the webinar sign up that I've just asked Matt to run through at the moment. So yeah, the first one, very interested to know how much an 11-year-old girl should be eating at this stage, bearing in mind their growth needs and puberty, etc.
For us, this will completely depend on training load, physical activity level, what's going on at school, etc. But again, eat to hunger and follow the general guidelines. 1/3 to 1/2 a plate of complex carbohydrates, 1/3 of proteins from fish, meat and dairy, and the rest vegetables with essential fats for flavour. The other thing to think about here is to snack on carbohydrate and protein in between your meals. I might be a 20-gram protein snack, or the other thing to think about is that protein should never be used as a substitute for carbohydrate, and therefore carbohydrate protein mixes are quite good. Things like milkshakes or milk, because it has both carbohydrate and protein in it. And again, the couple of things we talked about before, but genuinely focus on calcium and iron rich foods will be key during obviously growth and puberty, particularly in the adolescent female.
Okay, yeah, another question that we had, what natural protein supplement could you recommend to help with muscle growth as well as a protein-rich diet?
We talked about it before, and the simple answer is none. Absolutely get your protein from food at this age and stage. Supplements, again, potentially contaminated and dangerous, but with a reasonably well-balanced diet, you can absolutely get it. Hopefully the portion size slide will help you. The 20 to 30 grams of each meal is sufficient for growth. So the simple answer is supplements, probably not. Absolutely get it from food.
The final question before we just take a couple on the chat, is non-dairy protein, i.e. peas, as good as dairy whey proteins in shakes?
Simple answer to some of the non-dairy based proteins are that they don't provide enough branched chain amino acids or BCAAs, which are essential for growth and repair. What we also know about those types of dairy products is they're absorbed slower and tend not to taste as good. I guess here, if there is no medical reason or dietary reason to avoid dairy, we would absolutely recommend it, both from a protein and calcium content. And again, choose milk over supplements. If using milk alternatives, opt for the fortified versions to ensure the athlete doesn't miss out on key macronutrients.
Thanks there. So we did have a couple of questions that popped through on the chat. A good question regarding water there, related to water. So the 2 to 3 litres per day of water Does that include hot drinks for water and what you'll get in vegetables, or is that just plain water?
No, it's any form of water, any form of liquid, 2 to 3 litres. That's not just pure water plus your additions. You can get it from a nice brew if you wish.
Last question we had, just regarding whether someone, a younger person, aged sort of 11, isn't having a meal between school and packed lunch between training sessions. What would you sort of recommend as an ideal snack between sort of going from school to going on to a training session?
I think the snack has to include both carbohydrate and protein. Again, you want those probably more complex carbohydrates potentially that'll fuel the full session, but some really good snacks. Sandwiches are quite good, reasonably easy to make, like a meat sandwich, ham sandwich, chicken wrap, or something reasonably simple like yogurt and fruit. So the yogurt will have both protein and carbohydrate in it, and then the fruit will be a reasonably good source of quick energy. So they provide enough energy for not only picking them up straight after school, but also the full session.
That's great. With that there, thank you for that, Matt. So with nutrition obviously being a very big and popular topic, do apologise that some of the questions that perhaps were sent through haven't been answered. But as Matt mentioned, a couple of questions relating to the vegetarian, we'll look to get a one-page summary sheet on vegetarian there with that there. So this webinar, along with some additional resources, will get uploaded onto the Talent Parent webpage in next week sometime. So thank you all for accessing this webinar tonight. Hope you took a lot from it, and thank you to Matt for delivering it tonight.
Thanks a lot, guys.